today. It's my pleasure to introduce Miki Nguyen, who worked with Dr. Alana O'Malley on a presentation called Biases and Prejudices, Ethnic Differences in Psychopathy, and the Validity of the PCL-R scoring system. We'll have time for questions afterwards. And Dr. O'Malley will get to present Miki with their stole and toward their graduation. Miki, thank you so much for your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my symposium today. Today I'll be talking about ethnic differences in psychopathy, as well as the validity of the PCL-R scoring system, as well as how biases and prejudices can affect that. So this is just a general overview of what I'll be going over during my presentation today, and that includes the definition and the introduction to psychopathy, as well as the validity of the PCL-R system, and then we'll go ahead and dive into ethnic differences in psychopathy, as well as the biases and prejudices that surround that as well. So despite the growing interest in psychopathy, societal stereotypes have misconstrued the true definition of what it really means. This leads to misrepresentation. As many of us in the general public are lay people, we often use these terms as synonyms when referring to psychopathy or psychopaths. This includes crazy, insane, criminal, maniac, violent, dangerous, and etc. But not all those with psychopathic traits are criminals or are violent. Likewise, the terms crazy, maniac, and the like are stigmatized and demonstrate discriminatory and ableist language. So this is the actual definition of psychopathy. It is a personality disorder that manifests as a syndrome characterized by a constellation of affective, interpersonal lifestyle with antisocial features. So that's great. We have an official definition now, but what does this actually mean? To break it down a little bit further, we have some general definitions of what psychopathy entails. Part of the diagnosis of psychopathy looks at an individual's interpersonal aspects, which pertains to their relationships and communications with others. Specifically, those with psychopathy are arrogant, deceitful, and manipulative. The affective aspect is in regards to mood and emotion. It encompasses attitudes or emotions that are elicited by stimulus. Effectively, those who are diagnosed with psychopathy lack empathy, guilt, remorse, and are callous. And then finally, another general aspect of psychopathy is that there's the antisocial aspect, which is the disregard or violation of the feeling of others. So now that we have a general overview of psychopathy, what are some potential causes? Are we born with it? Do we just wake up one day like, wow, I'm feeling a little different? It's a lot more complicated than that. Like many other topics in psychology, a complex interplay between genetic and environmental factors contribute to the risk of developing psychopathic traits. Genetically, while only a handful of studies have been done, research identified genes in those with psychopathic tendencies involved in the serotonergic and oxytocinergic systems. These systems contribute to reduced emotional reactivity and capacity for attachment to others. Environmentally, risk factors for psychopathy include prenatal maternal stress, child maltreatment during childhood and adolescence, harsh parental discipline, negative parental emotions, disorganized parent-child attachments, and disrupted family functioning. Conversely, responsive and consistent parenting is associated with the reduced risk of developing antisocial behavior and psychopathy. It's important to recognize that without these genetically informative studies, it's not possible to evaluate the impacts of environmental risk factors. The reason for that is because various risk factors that are thought to be environmental can also reflect genetic predispositions of people who are a part of this environment. This is known to be the gene-environment correlation. For instance, parents that have genetic variants that activate certain psychopathic tendencies will have an increased risk for negative and harmful parenting practices. Therefore, the child may not only have a risk of having those genes passed on to them, but they're also subject to dysfunctional parenting as well. Furthermore, psychopathy has increasingly become considered a neurodevelopmental disorder which involves activity or lack thereof in certain regions of the brain. So how exactly do we measure psychopathy? That's a great question, right? Because we need to know how mental health professionals like psychologists or forensic psychiatrists determine who has psychopathic tendencies. It's definitely not some sort of natural radar sensor that they have, and it's not luck of the draw where it's an I choose you type of deal. Instead, they use the Hare Psychopathy Checklist tool, also known as the PCL-R test, which is a diagnostic tool used to measure an individual's psychopathic tendencies. This scoring system in particular is the most widely used and accepted assessment of psychopathy. It has been standardized and acknowledged by those in clinical and forensic communities. Compared to any other measure, the PCL-R is the most extensively validated clinical measure of psychopathy. The PCL-R checklist is a revised version of the original Hare Psychopathy checklist, hence the addition of the letter R. The checklist is largely influenced by clinical observations of Hervey Cleckley regarding psychopathic personality. So I gave you a definition of PCL-R scoring system, but I'm sure many of you are thinking that I haven't yet touched on how exactly it's measured. So here on the slide is a general overview and structure of the PCL-R test. There are 20 items that are scored on a 3 ordinal scale. That's 0, 1, or 2. 0 means that the trait is definitely not present. 2 is that the trait is definitely present. And 1 is either the information is inconsistent, incomplete, or there's a possibility that the trait might be present. The total score, which is the sum of all the scores from all 20 items, range from 0 to 40. The higher the score indicates a higher manifestation of traits that underlie psychopathy. In the US specifically, the threshold to diagnose psychopathy is 30. So if you have a score of 30 or above, then you're most likely to be diagnosed with psychopathy. To measure these 20 items, which I'll go over shortly, the individual using the PCL-R checklist will review the individual's institutional files as well as conduct a semi-structured interview. The institutional files include the client's files, records, and history, since we don't want to measure just the current moment, but their lifelong behaviors and characteristics. And a semi-structured interview is an interview in which an interviewer asks only a few predetermined questions, while the rest of the questions are not planned in advance. That way there's more of a connection, there's a way to kind of probe the client into getting more information about what their lifestyle is like. These are the 20 items that are used in the PCL-R scoring system, which is essentially just the 20 psychopathic traits that are used to measure. Many of these are well known due to infamous individuals diagnosed with psychopathy. If you take a look at the list, things like superficial charm, manipulation, lack of remorse or guilt, lack of empathy, and juvenile delinquency are some of the traits that were seen in individuals like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, etc. And this is just a breakdown of the 4-facet model that the PCL-R test also uses. It essentially just categorizes the aforementioned traits into the general factors of interpersonal and affective and chronic antisocial lifestyle. So not everybody is qualified to use the PCL-R to diagnose individuals with psychopathy. Despite the name, it's not a simple task of checking off items off a list and calling it a day. Some qualifications to diagnose clients include an advanced degree in the relevant fields, appropriate professional credentials, experience, and adequate training and experience using the PCL-R. As the most extensively validated clinical measure of psychopathy, cross-validation is included as well. And this is a technique used to assess how the results of a statistical analysis will generalize to an independent data set. So the items listed on the screen above are directly from the PCL-R manual, which claim that using the PCL-R has been validated by the following populations. I'd like to direct your attention to the mention of African American offenders with no other mentions of other ethnicities. So we have finally reached the big question of the day. Are there ethnic differences in psychopathy, or do biases and prejudices determine that? The short answer is maybe yes, maybe no. And I know it's a very unsatisfying answer, but despite the growing interest in psychopathy, the discussion regarding the correlation between ethnicity and psychopathy in specific has hardly been touched upon. In the small handful of studies that have been done, there have been no meaningful differences in the levels of core psychopathic traits between ethnicities. However, further research should be done in order to make a concrete conclusion. Even though more research needs to be done, studies have consistently shown that based on the PCL-R scoring system, on average, those in the Black community have a higher PCL-R score by less than 1 point compared to white individuals. Additionally, research for psychopathy as a whole has mostly centered on white incarcerated males. Other studies focus on the difference in scores between the Black community and those in the white community, but not much has been said on other ethnicities. So there isn't too much information or statistics regarding the prevalence of psychopathy between ethnicities, but I still wanted to bring your attention to these numbers in particular. So approximately 1% of prevalence is for psychopathy is for the general population in the US. And then we have 16 to 25% for incarcerated males, and then 7 to 17% for incarcerated women in the US. So why exactly is this important? Here is why. Psychopathy is associated with enormous financial and personal costs to the individual's family and victims, and society such that has been identified by some as the most expensive mental health disorder and a major public health issue. This implies that those who are incarcerated would most likely have not had the resources or access to the necessary resources to reduce risk factors or effective means to reduce antisocial behavior. Additionally, this extends to less privileged groups in general. While it may be due to financial status, race, ethnicity, gender, etc., the lack of accessibility to resources is evident. And then we have the 3 crucial issues regarding relation between ethnicity and psychopathy. The first being construct generalization, which indicates the issue that mechanisms that underlie psychopathy may differ for different ethnicities. The second being the measures of psychopathy, which directs your attention directly to the PCL-R, which states that it generalizes across all ethnic groups. And lastly, the implication that the levels of psychopathy are equivalent across ethnic groups can also be an issue. Again, generalization is a major issue as we know that in addition to the complexity of psychopathy as a whole, it is also influenced by the interaction of genetics and sociocultural factors, and that can differ for each ethnic group. So I know that when I was conducting research, I found myself very unsatisfied with the lack of concrete findings, but I think most importantly, it was the lack of discussion to begin with that was really disheartening. The number of people who do not have access to help and resources due to societal systems that keep the privileged privileged and the minority groups oppressed is astronomical. And the systems that are put in place today play a larger role than you think. Therefore, I propose that as the very bare minimum, to expand this research is to educate the public that this is an issue, beginning with correcting media representation and educating the public on the impacts and consequences of ableist language. Additionally, this field of research needs an appropriate budget to expand the research on. In regards to the PCL-R specifically, we need to acknowledge the limitations. Making revisions upon revisions will lead to improvements and better outcomes in our mental health systems. So after all this, is it actually possible to invoke psychopathic traits? And does societal oppression play a role? You bet it does. So the reason I don't have anything listed on this slide in particular is because I don't want this to be another lecture. I think this is important to become a discussion. I would like you to really reflect on some of the things we went over during the presentation and the words that I'm conveying right now. Right? So societal expectations and stereotypes have molded the word psychopath into a whole new meaning, one which is synonymous to words associated with negative attitudes such as crazy, criminal, and insane. While the public is told that imprisoning those who exhibit signs of psychopaths is for the safety of others and themselves, they fail to mention the limitations and not only the measures of psychopathy, but also the failure to acknowledge the lack of help and resources that are provided to them. Furthermore, the Black population in the U.S. is grossly overrepresented in the U.S. criminal justice system and are at risk for poor outcomes in our mental health systems. This is the same Black population in the U.S. who constantly have systems fighting against them rather than representing them. Likewise, with systematic oppression, those from various ethnic groups are forced into living conditions and situations that put them and others at a higher risk for psychopathic tendencies. In conclusion, more research needs to be done, changes need to be made, awareness needs to be spread, and complexities and other various factors need to be kept in mind. Generalization is harmful. Privilege and whiteness are not the default. The overrepresentation of minority groups in the criminal system should be an alarming red flag. Therefore, actions must be taken. I just want to send a special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Alana O'Malley, for guiding me through this amazing opportunity with a lot of patience and kindness. I know it's been a pretty rough road, but you were there for me the whole time, so I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Dr. Emma Wolk as well as Dr. McCracken for their efforts in guiding me through this process as well. And these are my references. Thank you guys for attending my symposium. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.
Questions for Miki? I have a first general question. Can you, and I know this is beyond the scope of this project, we talked a little bit about lack of resources to treatment. Can you tell us a little bit about what treatment for psychopathy looks like? Again, I guess for people who do have a lot of resources, or is there any form of treatment? You talked about people who are incarcerated having a higher rate of psychopathy. Is there any kind of therapeutic treatment in or outside of the U.S. penal system for people who exhibit these traits?
I can't speak for outside of the U.S. because I know, even the threshold here is higher than those in other countries, say the Netherlands, for example. There is no cure for psychopathy, but in terms of treatment, it's kind of just ways to reduce the risk factors of antisocial behaviors and psychopathic tendencies. I don't know the specifics on it, but if that kind of treatment is expensive to begin with and kind of difficult to have access to, then I'm sure the general public not only is not aware of it, but have no means to actually find the resources when they need it.
Yeah, I think that I realized during your presentation, my last interaction with this topic on reading your abstract was probably reading the John Hanson book, The Psychopath Test, for a lay audience, obviously, but I was thinking when you're speaking, I don't know anything about the treatment option, even though it's a disorder that plays such a big role in our imagination and in pop culture. It gets attention, but yes, obviously, just to prove your point that we know very little. I know very little about it.
Yeah, even when I was doing research, I didn't really find much information myself as someone who's actively searching for that information. So,
really fascinating. Other questions for Miki?
Yeah, I'm curious about if during your research you ran across a similar theme of bias and prejudice affecting treatment and diagnosis of other mental health. I know that might not have been from your research.
I don't think I personally came across any of that because there are very few sources on this topic to begin with, but I can definitely imagine that this is not only limited to psychopathy, but to the general mental illnesses and disorders in general. Even in media representation, day-to-day talk, if you're talking about your friend, you're oh yeah, that's crazy. That's sometimes we don't think about it, but that kind of ableist language kind of stigmatizes that community.
Thank you.
Yes.
Not so much a question, but an observation. I'm an outsider to your field. I teach an English program, but I do mentor a lot of fiction writers. And listening to you today helps me understand how important it is for people in our program who invent supposedly fictional characters that are always based on some kind of real life assumption, to be in greater dialogue with people in your field who become part of your solution. So I appreciate the research that you're doing very much. I learned quite a lot from you today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Yes. Do you have any plans to further your research on this topic since it's so interesting and prevalent?
Definitely yes, just because even starting the process of research was very, very difficult. I had maybe 2 sources that I could constantly come back to for information. Other sources either like had really inconsistent information or just kept repeating like, oh, not enough research is done, so we don't know. So I think getting started on that like initiative of actually putting our foot down and you know, acknowledging that this is a problem to begin with is something that's really important.
Thank you so much, Miki. I know that to do the best part, which is to invite you, I mean, the best part is to learn from your presentation. The other best part is to invite your advisor up to give you the stole and cord. It's a symbol of everything you've done in honors, and you'll get to wear with your regalia. So congratulations. Thank you, Dr. O'Malley. Everyone who is here, I'm going to lock the door until everyone takes some cookies. I see there are a lot